Ladies and gentlemen, may I welcome you to this book launch and discussion and debate, which is being held jointly by the Danube Institute, of which I'm president, and by the Helena History Press. And I want to begin by thanking the entrepreneurs behind the Helena History Press, Katalin Kaidolin, who's with us today, for first of all being here, but also secondly for having arranged and organized the publication of a translated version of a great book. The great book is the one you have in front of you, and which will be available later. It is entitled Lost Prestige, and it describes the way in which Hungary's image changed in Britain between the 1890s and the outbreak of war. That, of course, is a fascinating topic in its own right, but it's particularly fascinating at this point because we're still in the 100th anniversary year of the Trianon Treaty, and it was, in some part at least, as a result of the lost prestige that Hungary had in the 1890s, but had lost by 1914, that Hungary received such shabby and disgraceful treatment in the Trianon Conference. It was not obviously the sole reason, but it was an important one. It's true, of course, that at that conference there was a last-minute statement and feeling of regret by Lloyd George, then Britain's Prime Minister, as a result of the celebrated speech of Count Apponyi. But that came later. It was an effort by Lloyd George to, in a sense, reverse what everybody was beginning to see, though it was in the interest of many to deny, was an outcome of the peace treaty for Hungary that was extraordinarily unfair to that country, but also probably laid down the seeds of future difficulties in Europe, which indeed proved to be the case. We're lucky on this occasion to have the author, Géza Jeszenszky, an extremely distinguished historian, an extremely distinguished political figure in Hungary, an extremely distinguished diplomat, and perhaps I should say an extremely distinguished dissident, a member of a group of dissidents who helped to lay the foundations for the transformation of Hungary from communism peacefully to a democratic society, and we're very grateful that he is here. I am in the middle of reading the book, and I'm enjoying it immensely. I must say, the influence of journalists, I speak as a journalist, is something I normally deplore. But on this occasion, it seems that some of the British journalists who are writing about Hungary, though they may have, in a sense, damaged the country, they might not have done so if some of their views had been heeded earlier than the war when the war broke out. We will ask Dr. Jeszenszky to speak to us. After which I will invite two very distinguished historians, and Tibor Frank and Eva Beretsky to comment, and then we will have a debate and questions from the floor. All three speakers today combine historical knowledge, great reputation as historians, but I think almost as important in this case, a deep knowledge of the English-speaking world in which they have worked and written. So I think we are in for an extremely important, but I expect also an extremely fascinating and lively debate and discussion. So on your behalf, and on the behalf of the Helena History Press, let me welcome you here and invite Dr. Jeszenszky to give his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an immensely great pleasure for me to have reached this and to have lived until this date. Originally, I wrote this book more than 35 years ago. The publication was in 1986. And, well, obviously, since the subject, I hoped always that it would be available in English language. But for that, I needed a translation, and I needed a publisher. Now, the translation was in fact ready in the early 90s, and I don't know whether Brian McLean is not yet here. He indicated that, well, he's a resident in Hungary, a British subject, I suppose, but because of the pandemic, he and his family was, I think, a bit concerned whether to make a presence here. But anyhow, so he translated it, but naturally, obviously, without the original translations, as I, of course, translated the original English diplomatic reports and extracts from books and periodicals and, of course, the Times daily dispatches into Hungarian. And that was, it was my duty eventually to fill the many vacancies in the translation by giving the English originals. At that time, in the early 90s, as long as I was in government, obviously I had no time to do that. And later on, I thought that, well, I needed about 3 months because it was not an easy and automatic task. I never had the 3 months ever since, especially as there was no kind of threat or pledge for an English publication or for an English publication. So it was some time ago, not long ago, that I came to know Kati, Kádár Kati, the owner, I suppose, of the Helena History Press. And having discussed many things, well, she's, of course, not only a student of Hungarian history, but a graduate of Hungarian scholars, and I think Tibor was her supervisor. This subject obviously not only interested her, but also fascinated her. And then came the very nice offer to bring out the book in English. Then I set to work. There was no more delay, and it took more than 3 months. You can expect a historian like myself, a professional, cannot bring out a new edition in another language which the person wrote more than 30, 35 years earlier. So I didn't have to rewrite the book, and I always insisted that I'd never felt that a book written in the last decade of communism needed any substantial revision if one wants to come out with a new one. But a scholar has to consider all, or as much possible, all the important works, details, comments pertaining to the subject which has come out in the more than 3 decades. So that took me certainly some time, but I had a little bit more leisure, so the result is substantially more than the original Hungarian edition. And then the good luck that when I was already working on this English version and finding my original notes, Xerox copies, and looking up some other books, then I met the owner and editor of Fekete-Sas, a smaller Hungarian publishing house. And as I was also writing a little paper for a new edition of US General Buntholt's diary, which is now just coming out, a new, much better edition. And I also added a preface or introduction to that book. So the publisher offered me a new Hungarian edition. Then I wouldn't say that I had to translate from my English version, the Hungarian one, but really based on my English manuscript, I could add more than a few sentences to the Hungarian one. And I also added a chapter, which is not in the American edition, but I recommend it, as John O'Sullivan was kind enough to offer to publish it in the Hungarian Review. So this new chapter is a counterfactual history, and I hope that it will interest, if not fascinate, many Hungarians and perhaps even some foreign readers, because in this last chapter, I started from the assumption that the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was really an ill luck. The first attempt failed, and then there was just a mistake of the driver and the organizer of the whole visit, that his car happened to stop just in front of a cafe or pub where Gavrilo Princip was very sad, thinking that the attempt failed. And then there is the car in front of him, so he could shot them point range, so from probably such a distance. I have no weapon here. So I have no reason, of course. But I think Princip had no reason, really, to kill just that Habsburg who was the kindest to the Habsburgs and was looking for his own reign to somehow to emancipate the non-German and non-Hungarian peoples in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. So I started from this, saying that if the attempt had not succeeded, obviously the July 1914 crisis would have been unnecessary, and so the war wouldn't have started. And starting from that, using contemporary records of the Archduke, his advisors, Hungarian and other advisors, and knowing the characters of the time, including Prime Minister Tisza and both his friends and his opponents. So I wrote a chapter of Hungarian history starting with 1914 and ending in 1919. Well, I hope it will interest you sufficiently. I just say that in my story, the heir, of course, ascends the throne, the Habsburg throne, coronated in Vienna, and the Hungarian coronation is delayed because of constitutional problems. So he, by royal decree, introduces universal suffrage, which was, of course, the big debate of the time, and there are protests. And finally, when after a new Hungarian election, which brings majority to a government appointed by him, based on universal suffrage, the great moment comes in the Mátyás Church, the coronation, and just before the crown of St. Stephen is put on his head, an assassin from the crowd, a Hungarian nationalist MP, kills him. So on the same day when Charles IV was coronated, received the crown, then he comes to the throne, and before he really starts his own reign, Tisza István, who had to resign after the death of Franz Joseph, he, in a big rally against universal suffrage, is killed by Ilona Ducsinska, a Hungarian noblewoman who planned to kill him, but was prevented by many various events. So the big tragedy, but this tragedy, the death of the prime minister or the former prime minister, brings about a kind of spirit of reconciliation. And in 1918, a new government by a former supporter of Tisza, Elemér Jakabfi, who became well known in Transylvania, in Romania, as an advocate of Hungarian rights, but before that, he was also advocating the emancipation of the Romanians. So he becomes the prime minister and appoints Oskar Jászai as minister for the emancipation of the non-Hungarian minorities. And he passes those three laws, which we know from Hungarian history that he did introduce in 1918. And of course, then the new parliament passes them, and King Charles IV sanctions this on April the 11th, just on the anniversary of the sanctioning of the April laws in 1848. So that is the happy ending of my story, and it is not in the English version, but it is in the Hungarian version, so those who read Hungarian can read it, and hopefully thanks to you. So I thought that was more than enough for me as an introduction, and I am too looking forward to the opinion of two friends of mine who knows as much, if not more, about Hungarian and English history and their connections as myself. Thank you.
It is said, that human intelligence begins when the first man emerges from Proterozoic slime and carries on until somebody stands up to give a public speech. I'm afraid I made two errors in my opening remarks. One is that I was supposed to tell you that at the end of our discussion, the reception will, if you're going to the reception, you should go through the next room and on to the third room at the back. The second is I afraid misnamed our second speaker, the distinguished historian, Agnes Beretsky. Professor Beretsky.
So, thank you very much. And so I have to tell you, before coming here, I looked at my bookshelf. And I already found two lost prestiges. And the first one I looked at was the 1986 edition, the little blue book. That was a real eye-opener for me during my studies as a history English MA student. And then the next one, a presentation copy, which I very much cherish, was of great value for my dissertation. And so now we are here to celebrate the third and English version, which is a much more extended lost prestige here, with a bibliography amounting to 14 pages. And I'm absolutely sure that it is, and it certainly will be, an indispensable piece for professionals and public alike. So let me now say a few things, summarize in 3 points what I liked about this book very much. Firstly, the title, Lost Prestige. This is an incredibly telling title, as from a Western and more particular British point of view, one can interpret Hungarian history from the 1848 revolution up to the close of Cold War as alternating periods of high esteem, British high esteem, even admiration, or very critical periods. After 1920, however, a third option needs to be included, and that's ignorance or disinterest. I myself, an English MA person, probably feel that the other way, instead of prestige lost, lost prestige, prestige lost, would have been a little bit more emphatic title, and a bit more dramatic too. The second thing, apart from the title, is that I like is the fifth chapter, because the author devotes this entire chapter, some 50 pages, on the constitutional crisis, and rightly so. He calls the attention to the Hungarian jurists and politicians' extraordinary skill, as was quoted by Henry Wickham Steed. Their obsessive preoccupation with the formal ritual as a substitute for electoral and social reform. The debates over titles, hyphens, badges, flags, uniforms, and particularly the language of command in the army, some 70 words, dominated political life, Hungarian political life, up to the Great War. Chapter 5 reminded me of the popular nursery rhyme, for the want of nail the shoe was lost, for the want of shoe the horse was lost, for the want of horse the rider was lost, and so on. And the rhyme ends with the exclamation, all for the want of a horseshoe nail. So can we argue that the horseshoe nail upon which, if not the kingdom, because it survived Trianon, but its integrity was lost, was the constitutional crisis, or more closely, the futile debate over some 70 words? I leave you with that question for a while. And explain that scholars generally agree that Trianon was the result primarily of the Entente wartime strategy and the lost war, and yet the constitutional crisis was so significant because it had two very unfortunate results. Result number one was the military, owing to this maniac preoccupation I was talking about with the constitutional question. The Hungarian parliament successfully blocked the modernization of the Austro-Hungarian army for more than a decade. So that was something unique in the region. And the Austro-Hungarian army, because of that, rapidly fell behind its rivals militarily and became fully dependent on the German High Command a decade later during the Great War. And secondly, and in line more with the book, the constitutional crisis destroyed the reputation of the Hungarian politicians, and more importantly, that of the Hungarian nation for several decades to come. As Lost Prestige explains, after 1907 and 8, no one in England believed in the idea of liberal Hungary. But how long this negative image prevailed? And to illustrate the extent of the harm done, let me invite another British historian, Károlyi-palota McCartney, whose papers I managed to read, and who was Seton Watson's disciple first, then a pro-Hungarian opponent. And 2 weeks ago, I had a chance to do some research again, and I have come across a miscatalogue letter written by McCartney, and let me quote a little bit about this. Quote starts, "The trouble has been all along." He wrote it in 1934, so 14 years after the Treaty of Trianon. "The trouble has been all along that the only people who enjoyed any reputation of having anything whatever about the country, Hungary, were uniformly hostile to it. And although a certain number of members of parliament and similar people from time to time made speeches about it, the immediate reply has been that they knew nothing about it, that they were only repeating what they were told from the other side, and that the real facts are quite different and will be found in the works of authorities referred to, brackets, hostile to Hungary," end of quote. As the fitting summary in Lost Prestige goes, all the wells were poisoned. Based on the vast amount of archival material, Professor Jeszenszky sets out to prove that this long-lasting hostility towards Hungary was not due to the authorities, that is Seton Watson's or Steed's inborn hatred. There was no such thing, or any conspiracy. There were no such things. But primarily to the coalition politicians, and unfortunately most of their colleagues, tragic lack of self-reflection, and their unwillingness to react to criticism in a scholarly way. Their letters and articles reveal that the formerly great friends of Hungary, Seton Watson and Steed, they admired Kossuth's people upon arriving to Hungary, both of them. They were addressed as paid agents, ticks, parasites, and usually as misinformed and unaware to the nuances of Hungarian history and politics. This was unfair and untrue. Both Seton Watson and Steed were intimately acquainted with Hungary, taking great pains to discover its landscapes. I once read, Steed wrote to a friend, "I had to travel 9,000 kilometers," he used in miles, "to get to know the country," so 9,000 kilometers. And both of them were intimately acquainted with Hungarian history and its constitution. And above all, they both learned Hungarian, and they were able to translate from Hungarian into English. Their unwillingness to accept natural assimilation, and almost all their one-sided arguments, and later distortions, which the Hungarians very clearly were against and criticized, had very different roots. In their overlapping and sometimes conflicting identities as liberals, nationalists, and particularly in Steed's case, imperialist. Lost Prestige doesn't elaborate on this, but Seton Watson's and Steed's writings suggest that they both largely remained unaware of the interplay of these three layers: adherence to lofty ideas of justice, British foreign political considerations and interests, as well as personal ties and emotions. Nevertheless, despite these shortcomings, McCartney, we call him back again, could argue in 1937, quote, "To magyar writers, Professor Seton Watson is anathema. I can, however, find no work from the other side still in 1937 to set against his, since his opponents either ignore or deny the problems of which he treats, instead of explaining them. The reason magyar view has yet to be expounded in any Western European language," McCartney argued. Meanwhile, he continued, Professor Seton Watson's works remain unsurpassed in any language as collections of the facts and utterances of modern statesmen and parliamentarians on the national question, end of quote. Let me complete. Not only Seton Watson's works on Hungary were unsurpassed, but in the mid-war period, the tireless Oxford professor came up with so far one of the best, if not the best, history of the Romanians in English, and later on with that of the Czechs and Slovaks too. Well, today we have gathered to celebrate a book that expounds the reason Magyar view. And it does it so without shunning the very sad fact that after 1920, the Hungarians in the successor states were soon worse off as a minority than the non-Hungarian peoples of Hungary had been. The mistreatment of the Hungarian minority still lingers on. Thus, on the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Trianon, the memory of the lost territory still stings. Yet, lost prestige is utterly devoid of two fairly typical Hungarian characteristics when talking about Trianon: self-pity and self-delusion. So the example has been set to follow at home and abroad alike. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Tibor Frank, who has a distinguished record of writing on this topic, but in particular I'd single out, given the other country involved, that you are a distinguished fellow of the Royal Historical Society in London.
Thank you. Good evening to everybody. This is a welcome event for all of us who encouraged Géza to publish the English version of this book have been encouraging for the last 35 years. This is a tribute to the History Helena Press and to its director that this happened now, and we are very happy to have a very good English version of the book, which I think will be of great interest to people in both Britain and the United States. Now, I would like to speak a bit about what happened before the time frame that is covered by this book and what happened afterwards. What happened before was the revolution of 1848-49, which was unsuccessful, unfortunately, and this was the result of a Russian attack on Hungary in 1849. And afterwards, many of the leaders were executed, particularly the military leaders, but also some of the excellent political leaders, except for one who was Lajos Kossuth, who was the de facto head of the revolution, who left the country immediately after the armistice and went first to Serbia and then to Turkey. And in Turkey, he was invited, or from Turkey, he was invited by the United States government to pay a visit to America. And so he took a ship which was sent for him by the American government, and he left for France first and then for Britain. He stopped in Britain, and then ultimately he left for the United States. This was in late 1851, and he stayed there for a little over 7 months. This made him very well known internationally, not only in the United States, where he went to collect some more money to continue his revolution if there would be enough arms and ammunition on his return to Hungary, which never happened. He spent the rest of his life, a very long life, in different countries, such as Britain and Italy in the first place. Altogether some 45 years in exile. He died in 1894, and I just put a great emphasis on this date because this is more or less the exact time when the Hungarian government back at home went over to an anti-minority politics, particularly under Baron Dezső Bánffy, who was a spokesperson of this policy for several years. And in between the death of Lajos Kossuth and the end of the century, Hungary changed a great deal from what it used to be and what it was acknowledged for in the second part of the 19th century. Why is that important as an introduction to Géza's book and the time frame of that book? Because most people in and out of Britain and the United States, but also in Europe and elsewhere, adored Hungary for the achievements of the revolution in 48-49 and thought that Hungary is a wonderful revolutionary country, a liberal country, a country with a great future. And they put that in innumerable books and pamphlets throughout this long second part of the 19th century. When Kossuth died, a number of books came out to praise him for his policies back in 1848. They still remembered in 1894 what he did in 1848-49. This is exactly the time when young journalists such as Robert William Seton Watson and Henry Wickham Steed first started to come to Austria-Hungary, and interestingly enough, and that's a very good point for all of us to remember and recall, the young Seton Watson came to Hungary because he remembered Kossuth. He thought that Kossuth was the real leader of Hungary, and he did a lot of good things for this country. And he came to various parts of Hungary in order to cherish the great spirit of Kossuth. And that changed, and that unfortunately changed in the next decade and a half, up until the First World War. Henry Wickham Steed was less, perhaps, liberal in his thinking, but he also underwent great changes in the same time period. There was also a third person, a historian, who also wrote a lot about Hungary and also about the Paris Peace Treaties, a 6-volume general treatment of the Paris Peace Treaties. That was Harold William Vazé Temperley. So we are talking about a number of eminent people, eminent in Britain, who covered what happened in Hungary in those years. And those years were not necessarily very fruitful for Hungarian politics. And one is tempted to believe that some of the points that Seton Watson made were right at that point. He had a number of, almost every year after 1905, he put out a different book trying to explain the situation in the Slovak region of Hungary, that was then still Hungary, what is today Slovakia, or the Transylvanian region of Hungary and other parts of the former Greater Hungary. In that sense, he really contributed a lot to the First World War and the aftermath of the First World War, when he became the Masaryk Professor of Central European History at the University of London, and as such a man of great prestige and great influence, which was not certainly very useful for Hungary at the peace treaties and afterwards. He published this enormous 600-page history of the Romanians in 1933, 1934, And that is an interesting period. This is when the post-war Hungarian government under István Count Bethlen realized for the first time that they have to do something for the treatment of Hungary outside the country in the English-speaking world. So Bethlen, who was an eminent statesman and a clever political figure, came to England, visited London and Cambridge, and gave some 4 different major speeches or lectures in England, and then these were published in both Hungarian and English in 1934. And I think that gave the idea to Bethlen that they should start a new journal in English, which would then reach out to the English-speaking world and explain what Hungary is all about and how unjust the peace treaty of Trianon was. This became the Hungarian, the first major Hungarian journal in English, and was the Hungarian Quarterly, something which we miss today very much because it has disappeared from the scene, because the first Hungarian Quarterly came out in 1936 for the first time and was available until 1944, early 1944. And it was a good paper. It was full of information about Hungary and mostly good information, reliable information. Of course, they were trying to fish for the goodwill of Britain and the United States. They had their whole circles in those 2 countries, and they were trying to get articles from members of the House of Lords. In some cases, the editor in Budapest wrote the article for some members of the House of Lords, and then they were published as such for influencing the international public opinion. This is the outcome, I think, of the Seton-Watson period. Seton-Watson was very effective in those years, in the 1930s. Not only was this book, The History of the Romanians, which is to date the best Romanian history book in English, but also he was very active in giving lectures everywhere in and out of Britain, and he was the actual shaper and maker of public opinion in Britain about Hungary, even well after the First World War. This is a very sad story, by the way, how those governments in the very end of the 19th century could really destroy the liberal and free image of Hungary that it enjoyed under Lajos Kossuth in the middle of the 19th century. This is the beginning of a long series of problems for Hungary in the English-speaking world. We still try to fight this with papers that exist today, like the Hungarian Review, and some books in English. There are more books today in English than ever before in the pre-First World War period. But one has the feeling that nothing is enough to shape foreign opinion in the English-speaking world about Hungary. The same is true to the French, the Francophone world, where we do less and I think not enough. There are some books also produced in those countries about Hungary, but this is a major subject. Who is writing what about a country today, and what is the general opinion about Hungary today, and how does this relate to the earlier image of the country at that time, or that Géza addressed in his book. I think it's a very good book, partly because it is based on archival material. He was able to go to Britain for some time in the early 1980s and collected some material from the National Archives and from some other collections, and that obviously is there in the book, so you can enjoy first-hand information about these journalists and historians, what they were doing. Not only are these three people represented in the book, there are many pamphlets and articles and studies and books brought up more or less from the middle of nowhere in the book by Géza, who did, I think, a very good job, particularly at the time when this was just not available, this was not just done, this was not even possible to be done. This was 1986 when this was first published, as several of us told you already. I think it is a good book also because it is bringing up a whole world which is largely forgotten, and that is the pre-Trianon world. We don't understand Trianon without this book, and how the British and the French governments, to a great extent also the American government, turned against the losers of the First World War, obviously Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. These were the five losers. And I think the losers had a bad lot. They lost a lot of territory. Hungary lost, as you probably know, something like 2/3 of its territory and about 2/3 of its population. So the population went down from 21 million to roughly about 8 million. This was the largest loss among these five losers of the war. And it paved the way, and this is where I want to finish my little introduction tonight. It paved the way towards Hungary's participation in a German alliance up until the end of the Second World War. That's the very sad part of the whole thing, because Hungarians believed, Hungarian governments as well as ordinary people through the whole period between the two world wars believed that Germany is their natural ally. Germany can help them. Germany and Italy, the Prime Minister of Hungary traveled to Italy in 1927 already to try and convince the Duce to help Hungary. And that went on and on and on, even in the Hitler times. And it, as I said, it paved the way towards a pro-Hitler policy through the worst years of the Second World War. And it ultimately contributed, Hungary parted with Germany far too late, which was which is the subject of a different book and a different lecture. I think, however, the total destruction of Hungary in 1944-45 was the result of this pro-German policies at that time. I think I stop here and we invite some questions and comments from the audience, if there are any, and try to answer them if possible. Thank you.
Professor Frank. Yes, it's on. Okay. Professor Frank, thank you very much. Now, I'm going to invite Géza Jeszenszky to respond to the two commentators, and then I'll ask a question to the panel, and then we'll throw it open to the floor. Yes, you might as well.
Thank you very much. First of all, I am very grateful to my friends and commentators, and I did not expect them to be so controversial that I have to defend my thesis, but neither did I expect them to praise me too much so that I should blush. But we know this old, very wise Latin saying, habent sua fata libelli, and I think I am really very lucky in the sense that not only I was able to bring out an English and also a new Hungarian edition after 35 years, but the time which has passed, especially not only the 100th anniversary of the peace treaty, but the comments and writings about that makes my work more topical than I had ever thought. Because when I started to write on this book, I was not sure how much it influenced the peace treaty, and my conclusion was that really the very fact that we lost our great reputation contributed very substantially to the very harsh and unfair treatment which Hungary received. And actually, evidence there is in the archives and in other sources that in fact those British experts who were working at the Paris Peace Conference in the territorial committees, which were in fact drawing up the border lines, were all more or less the disciples, the students of Seton Watson, and that influenced their decision in the actual delimitation of the border, whether what happens to Csallóköz, the gross Schütt Island, which is a purely Hungarian territory but passed to Czechoslovakia, the railway line on the Hungarian-Romanian border. So these very borders were the results of these experts and not of the leaders. So in fact, my original research brought me to the point that yes, a nation which wastes the sympathy which it has accumulated by its, let's say, 19th century conduct can suffer very really. And of course, those who especially suffer, the more than 3 million Hungarians who were detached from Hungary, were the victims, but were they the victims of Wickhamsteed and Seton Watson? After the First World War, many Hungarians thought that they were the grave diggers of the monarchy. And so the harsh treatment or the harsh recognition of their work before the First World War increased after the end of the war. And in fact, in the original work, my last chapter was a study not simply of the historiography of pre-war Hungarian history and the British and the foreign reactions to events in Hungary, but really how the Hungarian mind, how Hungarian politicians, leaders, authors, and ordinary people looked back at this lost prestige. And it was interesting to see that after the anger, understandable anger, such great authors like Gyula Szekfű wrote, yes, he did not think that Seton Watson should be praised, but he said that he was the first village explorer of old Hungary. And in the daily paper Magyar Nemzet, which was an anti-Nazi paper, there were several other writings like by István Gál, who was the greatest author of British-Hungarian relations, and Tibor was very much instrumental in the new edition of many of his writings. So he pointed out that, in fact, those British critics of the old Hungary were, in fact, well-wishers of Hungary as well, and the much better reactions should have been to listen to them. And actually, I also point out that at first these people were pro-Hungarian, very much attached not only to Kossuth, but they were very well received by many Hungarians, including Kossuth's friend and English envoy Ferenc Pulszky and his daughter Póli Pulszky and others. So in fact, the story is more dramatic that Hungary had so many friends in the late 19th, early 20th century, and some of them really supported Hungary until Hungary became the enemy of Britain. But these critics said the same, which many contemporary Hungarians, like Oskar Jászai, but to some degree, Tisza also recognized the need to placate the Romanians, which in fact, sadly, István Bethlen at that point did not approve. I also write about that in this new edition and also the Hungarian edition, I could place more emphasis on these lessons of history. But what was even more important, and perhaps more sad, that not rewriting, but revising my manuscript, I could not escape that we are again, Hungarians, making the same mistake in these very years. That we are receiving a lot of criticism, also praise from abroad, and the reaction is more or less exactly the same which was the reaction in the 10 years before the outbreak of the World War. Pointing out that, yes, some of this criticism is biased, is exaggerated, is not even true, but not seeing that there is a point, sometimes a very important and valid point in the criticism, and it would be wiser. This is what, for me, and I hope for many of my contemporaries, history and this book may show that it is wiser not to throw away friendships, but rather to acquire friendships. And on this 100th anniversary, there has been a lot of discussion and talk about, what a terrible fate has befallen upon Hungary, and, anger and sadness, understandably. But I think that some of the reactions, including my own writings, I wrote quite a few pieces on that we should, if we want to improve the lot of the Hungarians outside Hungary, and if we want to again regain the sympathy of the world, which we acquired in 1848-49, which we acquired in 1956, and we again acquired in 1989, with the role Hungary and Poland played in the fall of the communist dominoes. So we must rather take criticism to our heart, and I always quote Gyula Illyés, the great Hungarian poet, who, among others, really in 1943, said that, the Hungarian typical reaction is just to cry out how unfair and try to refute the criticism. But his advice was, and I think that is very valid today, that first we must read what is truly what is true in the criticism, and we must change those, let's say, bad habits, and we must listen to the well-meant advice, and only then should we turn to what should be rightly criticized and what should be refuted. So my happiness on this occasion that I have practically at the same time an English and a Hungarian edition is the wish which I think most historians sustain, but are afraid to say, that the hope that one can learn from history. This is the text of my Latin textbook, which at the age of 14 I first met, Historia est magistra vitae, Historiam distimus, non scole sed vitae distimus. So it is not for the school, for learned audiences, for whom I wrote this book. But really, I hope that this book will have a kind of response, and people will read it with the understanding that Trianon was largely due to losing our friends, and we must acquire friends if we want to change not the borders of Hungary, but if we want to change the treatment meted out to the Hungarian minorities in the neighboring states, and if we want to again to be as popular as we had been 120 years ago.
Thank you very much. Let me now ask, if I may, a question to all three of you. Same question, beginning with Professor Frank. And it, in a sense, arises from the title of the book, Lost Prestige. Yesterday, I happened to be moderating a discussion with Professor, among other people, Professor Tom Bar-Choi, Professor of History at Ryerson in Toronto, but of course also born in Budapest, a Transylvanian, and I think the cousin of Count Mikhail Károlyi. And he said, and this directly addresses the question of prestige, he said that at the close of the First World War, the Times wrote an editorial, presumably written by Wickham Steed, which ended by saying, and we must ensure that in future there could be no repetition of this kind of event arising from the ambitions and outdated views of Prussian Junkers and Magyar oligarchs. And Professor Bocskai went on to say about this comment, he said, that, of course, grossly exaggerates the degree to which Hungary was responsible for the war. It's prestige of a kind, but a black prestige, so to speak. And I have two questions, really, of all of you. One is, did perhaps lost prestige topple over into a grossly unfair prestige? And secondly, how do we fit into that notion, if it's one you accept, how do we fit into it the final moments of the Trianon Treaty in which there is the appearance of regret and realization that Hungary's treatment has been unfair in response to the famous speech of Count Apponyi, and an attempt, not long sustained, of course, by Lloyd George to, in a sense, moderate, if he could, the terms of the treaty. So, Professor Frank.
Well, I think the prestige was based on the 19th century achievements of Hungary, and that is what is lost in the Sieg-Botzen, Wickham-Steed, narrow temporary period. And I think that is that ever since that time, various political systems and various governments in Hungary try to change this situation with not much result, I would say. Not enough results, perhaps, that's better to say. The book will certainly add an important point to changing perception of Hungary. That's good. Not, I think, one book can do that alone. We need to use a lot of articles, a lot of maps, a lot of pamphlets, a lot of books to do that, and that might, in the longer run, change the atmosphere around Hungary. We'll see. It has not yet come. The other point is, well, I'm several of the great masters of the peace treaties of Paris said something to the effect that they did a bad job. Not only was George sort of sorry about Trianon, but also the other treaties went too far. They were angry, particularly France was very angry. Much of, and you should not forget that much of northern France was totally destroyed, completely destroyed. Italy also, northern Italy, a great deal of Russia also. The mood at the end of the war was such that people wanted an immediate answer to what happened. They wanted to destroy these countries which were behind their loss. Whether they were right or not, that's a different question. But I just argue that it is understandable that the mood in 1918, early 1919 was such that people wanted to take revenge for what happened. And you know probably just as well that some 10 million people died in the First World War. Yes, and that it was one of the first real mass killings in world history.
Okay, is it okay? Right, so if you read the book written by Harold Nicolson, who was the British, one of the British diplomats during the Paris Peace Treaty. And there he puts down that one of the biggest problems during the treaty was that originally there meant to be two treaties. One, the preliminary conference, where the winners come together, discuss what they want, and the winners opted for the maximum, clearly, because they were sure that their wishes will be, in a way, not fulfilled. But then conference fatigue set in, and the final conference never happened, where they originally had intended to invite the losers as well, and during heated debates and discussions, some kind of a compromise was about to be reached. So one of the big problems, I think, is truly this conference fatigue. So there was a point when they said, okay, enough is enough, and let's not talk about that anymore, right? And the second thing about Hungary, that the aim of war always is to win war. And as Professor Thibault Frank mentioned, that was the first wholesale big war. And the aim of Britain and the Entente was to gather as many supporters and allies as possible. And how can you gather allies? Well, you promise territories. How big as you can. And so that's why I mentioned that wartime strategy was very important in was an important player in the whole story. And together with conference fatigue, and of course those who were sitting there, we all know, Harold Nicolson even said, we never moved a yard without asking the then President Seton Watson and Steed, who were not officially members who drew the borders, but they were there, hiring a flat clothes, and they talked and met. So prestige was important because these people who actually held their very pencils, they were counseled and advised by Seton Watson and Steed. Thank you.
I'm agreeing entirely with what has been said, but if the victors were out to, I think the English phrase was, squeeze Germany till the pips squeak, how come it was that Germany was not nearly as hit by the peace terms as Hungary was?
Well, indeed, it was the German question which guided the whole story, even before the outbreak of the war. And commenting what Tibor said earlier, that yes, it was the 19th century image and reputation which was prevailing before the war. I would add something, that in the early 20th century, the British and Seton Watson and even more Steed expected Hungary to influence the foreign policy of the monarchy to restrain Germany. Well, they did not think that the war would break out inevitable, but the German tendencies, aggressiveness, building the fleet, cultivating the Muslim world, so certainly worried the British, perhaps understandably. And from the whole monarchy, but especially from its stabilizing and liberalizing force, this is what they called Hungary, they expected that Germany's ambition will be curtailed because there will be no brilliant second, there will be no real reliable ally for Germany in case of a real conflict. Now, McCartney, who was the younger colleague of Seton Watson, and that originally they were quite on good terms, but whereas McCartney supported the minor revision of the Hungarian borders, especially the First Vienna Award, Seton Watson broke with him, and well, Agnes wrote an excellent book on this issue. But McCartney, in his magnificent history of the Habsburg Empire, he says that before the war, yes, there were these critics, but besides them, there were many English authors who continued to be sympathetic to the Hungarians. If the war had not come, perhaps this criticism would not have prevailed. So if Hungary, perhaps even if Hungary had remedied some of the faults of it. And even at the end of the war, even Nicholson, who professed himself to not to like, even so, certainly to dislike the Hungarians, very often he's quoted that Turanian race added very little to civilization and so on. But he also, in the British spirit, wanted to be fair. So he also advocated better borders for Hungary. And how is it that, well, this German question, that the Germans received an easier treatment? Well, I think on the one hand, Germany had to be still treated in a somewhat more fair way, because it was expected that Germany will remain there, and especially with Russia, into Bolshevik Russia, a kind of counterweight in the person of Germany was also expected. So not to humiliate Germany too much, although the Germans thought that they were terribly humiliated, and Hitler's rise was really due to the Versailles Treaty. But really, why Hungary lost much larger amount of territory and population than Germany? It was not simply because Germany was a bigger power and important power, but simply Hungary, as a result of the post-Ottoman Empire, post-Ottoman wars, was repopulated, and repopulated by Romanians, German Saxons or Swabians, Serbs, and so on. So Hungary, as we could see that already in 1914, and even more in 16, when Romania made the secret treaty of Bucharest and was promised Eastern Hungary, not more than Transylvania. So Hungary was the country which could be offered as a kind of prey, as a kind of reward for countries to bring in, to come back, to come into the war. First it was Italy. Italy had to be promised, of course, the South Tyrol, and Istria and others. Serbia, to sustain its very hard struggle, was promised already at the beginning of the war Bosnia-Herzegovina and southern part of Hungary. And the Russians already in September 1914 gave a pledge to Romania, just if Romania remained neutral, would receive Transylvania after the victorious war. So in fact, Hungary willy-nilly was a country which could be offered. And at the end of the war, well, that was the way to win, to dissolve, to promise very generous borders to the neighboring or to the nations of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. So it was to some degree bad luck that Hungary had to pay. It was certainly not something that the world, the outside world, had a kind of inborn dislike or hate of Hungarians. Today, at this 100th anniversary, there are such voices in Hungary which say that the whole World War was caused by the British, the French, just in order to destroy Hungary and to destroy that 1,000-year-old kingdom.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to throw open the discussion to questions from the floor, and I think our distinguished guest, Romanian ambassador, is
Yes, thank you. My name is Marius Lazurc. I'm the Romanian ambassador to Budapest. I'd like to congratulate Minister Jeszenszky, dear Géza, for this wonderful book. I haven't read it, and I'm looking forward to reading it. Let me also congratulate the panelists and the Danube Institute for having organized this event and for having invited me to this book presentation. I'm not the only ambassador in the room. There's the Mexican ambassador, the Croatian ambassador, not the only diplomatic representative. So I think that we could have even a diplomatic debate around this topical subject of ours. Let me also say a word of congratulations to the editor of this book and explain, because I think that my presence here invites a question, why am I here tonight? And this is a book, as Minister Jeszenszky said, about not only lost prestige, but also lost friends. And I'm here essentially, towards the end of my presence in Hungary, to give assurances to Minister Jeszenszky that you haven't lost a friend in me, and that I might have a way to prove this. I will look for a Romanian editor for your book if we can negotiate the copyright for this with your English editor. This is all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I have the next question, please? Yes. Gentleman over there.
Thank you. David Thompson. I'm a British citizen and long-term Hungarian resident. Firstly, I've bought the book. I haven't yet read it, but what I've heard in the last hour has made me look forward to it with even more enthusiasm than I had before. One of the comments that was made by you, Géza, was about the sort of Hungarian focus, or the way that we are in Hungary, and there is a natural way of looking at Hungary as the center. I think a former, a great novelist and politician and even organizer of the emperor's coronation in Hungary, Banfi, talked about the Hungarian globe. And that's almost inescapable in this setting, but I think there is more context. Firstly, and I don't say this with any pride, but if we think of the start of the Second World War, the British Prime Minister Chamberlain referred to Czechoslovakia as a small, faraway country, and Hungary is a further away country. So the British can be very isolated, isolationist. But we should remember that in 1914, and particularly with Mr. O'Sullivan here, the question of home rule existed within Britain then, and in parallel it does today. Then it was Ireland, but it was also Scotland. Today it's mainly Scotland, but it's also Northern Ireland. So we have talked so far today of what happened at Trianon, which was the second and less, from a Western British perspective, important treaty than Versailles, which was the one with Germany. We've talked about the other countries, but firstly, and I go back to Banfi and his Transylvanian trilogy, there is much discussion of Franz Ferdinand and his advisors about breaking up Hungary. Perhaps people think that Franz Ferdinand was anti-Hungarian. I think that's widely thought. But secondly, there were the Americans saying, what about the rights of the minorities, or the freeing some of the peoples? And we've mentioned perhaps Istria, Croatia, but there was Slovakia, which was part of Hungary for 1,000 years. It ceased to be part of Hungary in 1920, but there's been no enthusiasm from those countries to become part of a greater Hungary again in the century since. And that needs to be reflected on as well. So those are the sort of points I wanted to make. There is a wider context, and there are other points of view, and that home rule and minorities was not just a question in Hungary at the time. Thank you.
Who in the panel would like to respond?
Yeah.
Yes?
I would like to respond to one of your points. Yeah, I have been recently focusing on Seton Watson-Steed and two other Britons, and not just concerning the attitude about nationalism within the Greater Hungary, but also their attitude to nationalism within their own empire. which is a very interesting topic, how they viewed the Irish home rule aims. And we all know that they more or less wanted to offer the same, at least Sid Watson and Steed, more or less wanted to offer home rule. And Steed, even himself, as the foreign editor of the Times and then leading editor of the Times, he launched a campaign for Irish home rule, but nothing more. This is important, nothing more. So you see this discrepancy, staying in Versailles, kind of disrupting this country, and at the same time not allowing independence for the Celtic Irish. So that was happening. So give them rights, but not too much. And if you look at Egypt, and we look at some other dominions, India, that's even more interesting. They couldn't really think about an independent Egypt at that time. So your point is very interesting, that there are two parallel understandings of nationalism.
Yes, there's no nostalgia now in Britain for, say, Indian independence in 1947.
Yeah, that's right.
Nostalgia in Hungary for 1920.
Yeah.
Would anyone else like to comment?
Yes, I'd like to add just a word about home rule.
You can't be heard on the video.
I don't like that. The home rule question is important already in the 1880s when Gladstone in Parliament in 1886 compared the Irish home rule problem with the successful compromise between Austria and Hungary. And that he sort of offered as a good example to the British to try and come to terms with the Irish in the same way as the Austrians did with Hungary. So I think this is a comparison which comes up again and again in already earlier than Glasgow, but this is a recurrent problem in British thinking, how the Central European situation can be used as a comparison for Britain.
Just to comment on the home rule crisis in Ireland. Of course, the First World War was the factor which meant that the movement towards home rule was blocked. There had been an agreement. It was uncertain, given Ulster's somewhat falling resistance. It was uncertain how it would all work out. But at the same time, the putting it into cold storage until the end of the war, that produced, of course, the militarization, first of all, the rebellion in 16, and then the arrival back in Ireland of soldiers in the British Army who obviously were of nationalist sympathies, and they then became the focus, obviously, or the core of a military resistance, and we know what happened after that. So, I mean, I agree. All of these, the First World War interrupted and derailed a lot of very interesting experiments that might have been peacefully carried out. But I'm afraid that's a very cliched thing to say, and alas, it's one of those cliches that are very true. Let me, yes, the gentleman over there, and then I think there's a gentleman here who has a question.
Well, I'd like to speak to the Irish question too, because in 1918, the Irish Home Rule Party was completely wiped out, and it was replaced by Sinn Féin. And Sinn Féin was led by Arthur Griffith, who was, of course, the author of The Resurrection of Hungary. And the entire Sinn Féin political position was essentially based on a Hungarian political compromise of 1867. So my point is that if you say that prestige has been lost, then that means that prejudice has been created. And as part of that creation of prejudice, the identification of Hungary with Irish nationalism must surely have been a factor.
I'll leave it to anyone who would wish to answer. No response. We take the microphone away and give it to this gentleman again. and we can ask all three people to ask the question.
Thank you very much. I'm Croatian ambassador here in Budapest. Minister Jeszenszky, Géza, we know each other for years, and thank you very much for this additional endeavor and what you did also in this lingua franca of English. Well, as Professor Beretsky mentioned, what comes first? Is it prestige or loss? On one hand. On the other hand, we are in 21st century. Although being here mingled with historians or mostly pro-historians, I'm just a humble economist. So allow me to mention, we are in the very interesting world of 2020s with all these COVID measures and with masks, without masks, whatever. But all the challenges has come through COVID here with us. And now we have additional points. We have some lessons from the past. The analysis, which shows, as you bravely mentioned in your plaidoyer at the beginning, that some of the lessons are not so good for Hungary. And Hungary haven't even learned enough. I wouldn't say that Croatia has learned everything or just the best from its past, or Romania or whoever, or UK, with all the prestige that it has still. But it's 21st century, 28 minus 1 to come first. We are always speaking about Europe, but we are in European Union, believe it or not. But every time we are speaking about Europe, here in Budapest, most of the times. We are also speaking about Hungary, or even Great Hungary, in the Austro-Hungarian times. But it was Austro-Hungarian Empire, frankly speaking. Or, I mean, some of the things should be said as they are, or as they were. Too much interpretation sometimes, from this angle or that angle. Maybe more forward outlook. Maybe looking for what is in common. Maybe for asking for more solidarity even. This could help us more than dividing again. In this way or that way or this. So these cuttings always hurt. So maybe to find some brighter perspectives instead of I do understand fully the suffering and the missing points, opportunities, whatever, but at the end of the day, we are here and we are looking for tomorrow. So that's my plea. But the book is brilliant as much as because my Hungarian doesn't allow me to tackle your Hungarian edition. But this, what I heard, is brilliant. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much for your nice words, comments. And before I comment on that, just something on the Irish question, that Arthur Griffith, the maker of Ireland, who may be called, was obviously looking at Hungary as not simply as an example for Ireland, but the so-called compromise, the settlement between the dynasty and the Hungarians in 1867. Whereas those Hungarians, quite a few who sympathized with the Irish, were the so-called Hungarian nationalists who wanted a break with Austria, or at least a personal union replacing the dualist system. But I think what is really important is that this is an important link between, sorry, I can't find my, no. So I think the Irish remember Griffith and the Hungarian link perhaps more than the Hungarians, and we should also know more about that, and my book also tried to bring out this question. Well, with Croatia, of course, the critics of Hungary dealt very much with Croatia, and sympathetically, although eventually, especially Seton Watson endorsed the so-called Southern Slav idea, the unity, and Seton and Wickhamsteed, on the other hand, was instrumental in trying to bridge the very substantial difference during the war between Supilo and the other Croatians exiled and the Italians, who of course coveted much territory which in fact was inhabited by Croatians. But to have a positive or a more promising message, well, the book also, at least both the critics of contemporary Hungary and those who defended it, like in Hungary, very little known Leo Amery, the school friend of Churchill and later on cabinet minister, whose grandmother was a Hungarian Jew, which he was not trying to hide a little bit, but he was proud of his Hungarian background. And I think among all these British observers and authors on the Austro-Hungarian problem, his memorandum is the best because it advocates a solution not based on the narrow nationalist idea, but on a more European. So his memorandum is advocating a kind of supranational union, a federalized monarchy, and actually a forerunner of the European Union. And I always thought, and especially in the last 30 years, that the only solution for Trianon is the European Union, and the very principles which should guide all the countries of the European Union: respect for rights of human rights and respect for the rights of national minorities. And I think we can all agree upon that. Let's hope that all the politicians eventually will come to agree on that.
Thank you. There's another question here, and I think a question behind.
Excuse me. Hello, I'm Amy Modley. I'm a Hungarian-American, educated in the US, but fluent in both languages, work as a translator also. My question is that the perspective of loss of prestige is a very specific view, as in focus, and there are so many others. And the one that concerns me is that Trianon is also a loss of identity for Hungary, as I see it. And my concern is on its 100th anniversary is that the loss of identity left Hungary with a sense of it being a cripple, that it's often referred to as the country being truncated, megcsonkítva, that it's a cripple, and this psychological position for Hungary, I think, affects and influences its current and always politics, and that there's an element of victim still. And so my question is, when will Hungary, and I put this forward to everyone, find healing over this and move on into the 21st century and accept its history and move forward as opposed to carrying the weight of this burden forever? Hope not. Thank you.
Could you pass the microphone to the gentleman behind you?
Oh, thank you. Well, I just have a question to, I don't know, whoever might be interested in or answering it. You know, before the Trianon and the Versailles treaties, there was more than a year of discussions and negotiations and lobbying in the Paris Peace Conference. It started in January 1919, if not sooner. And it just went on forever. And this was an occasion for everybody to, and by everybody I mean all the different nationalities, countries, small countries, informal delegations. And yes, I think there were some Indians there. And they were still paying attention, or at least lip service, to Wilson's 14 points, which actually had 72 points, but that's another story. But my point is simply that countries such as Romania, the Czechs, Croatians, they all made major efforts to try to influence whatever was coming out of that conference, not just at the political level, but at the informal. It was major lobbying. And they were using not only formal delegations, but informal. The diaspora of these different nationalities was pretty active. And my question is simply, what did Hungary do? Because there was a Hungarian diaspora. It did have friends and certainly blood relations with the English and French and other aristocracies. And I'm just an amateur, but I haven't seen any references, nothing about what the Hungarian efforts were in this period leading up to the signing of the Treaty of Trianon.
Well, I think very little decided the fate of Hungary in a very little way what happened after the end of the war. In fact, the very borders, if not drawn exactly, but the sketches in broad outlines, they were ready. So when the question was certain towns, whether they will remain with Hungary or outside that. Lobbying, certainly the so-called victors, including the so-called successor states representatives, were very active in Paris, but their efforts, I don't think that brought much result, because it was the great powers, the big three, the big four, who decided, and their foreign ministers and their experts. So they tended to look down upon the nations, including the Romanians. Masaryk was a somewhat different case, and he was a kind of authority, but Hungarians were not allowed to lobby. Miklós Bánffy, with the, not only with the well wishes of all his Hungarian colleagues, aristocrats and friends, but also with the Károlyi government's support, tried to go to Britain and to France, but as enemy alien, he was not admitted, so he could not go further than Holland. But even if he had been able to even to call upon some friends, it would have had no result, because the broad outlines that the monarchy should be broken up to national units, and these units will be the mainstay of the new European order. In the back of Germany will be the allies of France. So that was the decisive. And as I said, perhaps these friends or unfriendly observers and experts influenced only just a little part of the territory, but not the whole attitude. And to the earlier intervention or question, I think Hungarians willy-nilly obviously accept Trianon and do not dream about, serious people do not dream about any substantial change in borders, but it will always remain a wound, and the remedy, the healing, would depend on our good friends or allies, how they accept that they have a Hungarian minority, and this minority is to stay and to have language rights, which is very slowly gaining ground. And with more European support and friends, I think all neighbors, and of course with the good foreign relations with the neighbors, we will come to the point when the existing or imaginary grievances of the Hungarians will disappear, and then with the borders in the European Union become invisible, and hopefully not in the far distant future we will have just what we had in the monarchy. We will have a common foreign policy. We will have a common army, NATO or European army, have a common currency, and of course a common economic territory. Then it will be each locality to opt for what language he or she or the village or the town uses, or more languages, as in the old monarchy. People were multilingual. So if Hungarian will be taught not only in Hungarian schools in Romania and in Slovakia, but even those Romanians who want to learn Hungarian, or Slovaks can learn in their own school some Hungarian, then I think the wound will be healed.
Yeah, sorry, may I just react to, just very quickly. You mentioned that we don't learn from our mistakes, and you're sort of right. But if you look at the 20th century, what you see is that the Hungarians were jumping from one obsession to the other, right? We had the constitutional kind of obsession, then we had the revisionist obsession, and then after the Second World War, another obsession of the country of iron and steel was forced upon us. And then finally, since 1990, I hope at least we have been obsession-free, or at least this is what we should do. That would be one point of learning. Getting back to your question about when Trianon will heal, I think Schengen borders are a piece of healing, and also some minority rights, some more excessive minority rights would do good as well. Thank you.
I'm going to ask for one final question. In that case, I will ask a final question myself and invite the three speakers to answer it, but also to accompany it with their closing remarks. And the question really is, the debate, the discussions in Paris were taking place against a background of extraordinary turbulence, not simply in Hungary, but in the whole of Eastern Europe. I mean, after all, you had already had the Bolshevik Revolution, you had Czech troops fighting the Bolsheviks in Russia. You had the Bela-Kun provisional government here, and you had uprisings in Munich and elsewhere. So throughout Europe, you have a feeling of the old order being completely overthrown. And I wonder whether or not, in acting against this background, without incidentally the participation of Hungarian diplomatic representatives, I wonder if the statesmen there said to themselves, we're living through a revolutionary period and we need to take decisive action, setting the world on a new path. And I wonder why they didn't. It seems to me that might have been part of it. And I wonder why they didn't say, in a period of revolution of this kind, surely we should try to shore up the existing institutions that have provided order over a long time. What was it that, how did their deliberations, how were they affected by the surrounding atmosphere of revolution? And then, if you could each answer that, beginning, Professor Frank, with you, and ending with Professor Jeszenszky, and we'll end the meeting. Thank you.
I think one point was not mentioned so far, and that is the Republic of Councils, the Soviet type of republic in the summer of the spring and summer of 1919, which left a very great imprint on the conference in Paris. A lot of people felt that this is a direct influence of the budding Soviet Russia, and that it's a danger for Central Europe that communism will spread over. I think that was an imminent feeling for many people outside Hungary also, and so they wanted to create a corridor of some sort which would cut off Russia from the rest of Central Europe. This was also behind the creation of these relatively small countries instead of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, which was the one of the top 5 empires in Europe and one of the top 5 military powers in Europe. but that the presence of the two revolutions and then the counter-revolution in 1918, 1919, 1920, that created a feeling of fear also in Paris, and they wanted to do something about that. And they did. And that was one of the reasons that the question came up, why they cut off so much from Hungary, or at the expense of Hungary. They also cut off a lot from Austria. Nobody laments about Austria losing the Czech lands and parts of Poland today, and parts of Ukraine today, and Slovenia, etc. So Austria also lost, it became a small country. And it is a small country, and you don't find many people in Austria lamenting about that. I'm not saying that it is not understandable to lament about what happened to Hungary, because every third family had members outside the border. The greatest problem with Trianon was that they cut off ethnic Hungarians, some 3.5 million of them, from mainland Hungary. So not only the territorial loss was huge, but also the loss of Hungarians who overnight found themselves in the neighboring countries. And that is still a wound in many families. This is not just a national wound, it's a personal wound in many families. This must be understood. Most of us have family members outside the country. And the Hungarian diaspora is a very large diaspora. It's not as big as the Russian or the Jewish or some others, but it's very big in contrast to the size of the country. And that is therefore not just a Trianon problem, it's also a problem of the emigration from the country already at the end of the 19th century. Some 4 million people left, altogether 4 million, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy for the United States, and roughly 1.5 to 2 million from Hungary. I say from Hungary, not necessarily Hungarians, because a lot of Slovaks also left. For example, there were 2.8 million Slovaks in what is today Slovakia. 700,000 of those left for the United States. This is just an example of the losses of the country before Trianon, before everything started to go wrong. So this is a complex pattern why Hungarians are sad about Trianon. Trianon is like a center of the problem, not the whole problem. It's something like a way to remember all the losses of Hungary from the 1880s onwards. Once again, immigration was rampant in the country, and it left Hungary without a lot of excellent people who could have worked in Hungary also.
Yeah, I would like to continue Professor Frank's story about the Austrian loss and talking about the German loss a little bit, getting back to a question that you mentioned some time ago, that Germany was not so affected, and I think Germany was very much affected, but not so much territorially, but prestige-wise. So someone should write a book of lost prestige for Germany. Before the war, they were dreaming of a superpower. They were economically absolutely top, right ahead of Britain. And then what happened? A truncated, totally annihilated sense of national consciousness. And then the result out of Hitler, we all know. So probably their loss was even bigger than Hungarians are not very good at compromise, they're not very good at accepting their lots. But we should look at some other countries, I think, sometimes. Thank you.
Tibor already pointed out, but did not expand the subject, Bolshevism and the peace treaties, and especially peace treaty of Trianon. Well, as those of you who are Hungarians and who know Hungarian history reasonably well are aware that the Károlyi government, which came to power and accepted how to deal with the crisis which they did not participate in making, but they had their hopes in President Wilson, in the 14 points, and in self-government, the principle of self-government, national self-determination. And why they rapidly lost their own popularity was very much due to the victors who, instead of inviting them to really what was not a peace conference, but only a preliminary conference of the victors, but in fact thinking that, well, this is just a Hungarian disguise, and another count is now heading the country of the Junkers, so Károly was not accepted really as a Democrat, which he was, whether he was not very competent a person, but he really meant well to be a pro-Entente Democrat even before the war ended. Now, that explains also why Hungary, or at least a part of Hungary, accepted Bolshevism, not really being aware of the doctrines of Marx. Even the Bolshevik leaders did not read much of Marx. But a new orientation, if the Entente is not ready to live up to its very promises, the 14 points, and self-determination, and allows all the neighbors of Hungary to invade the Hungary, to invade the country, and to occupy the territory which they claimed and coveted, and in fact a little bit more. The Serbs were occupying, of course, Pécs and Baja, so well over, and Romanians were on the Tisza. So then, in exasperation, Hungarians turned to Russia, Soviet Russia, thinking that, well, their invasion, they were proceeding westward. And they thought that, well, perhaps now being allied to Russia will save, if not the whole old historical territory of Hungary, but at least the ethnically Hungarian territories. But on the other hand, there was fear by the allies, by the victors of Bolshevism and the spread of Bolshevism. It was said that with Bolshevism coming to Hungary, that doctrine came to 36 hours distance from Paris. And of course, Germany was in the danger. Yes, in January of 1919, the Spartakists, the Bolsheviks, Germans were defeated. But Germany had a government of social democrats who were certainly not pro-allies, so the danger was seen by the victors that Bolshevism has come already to Hungary, will win Germany, and who knows what will happen in France and so on. So the conclusion was, and that was borne out by facts, that the only nationalism and national aggrandism and national helping the nationalism, or recognizing the nationalism and helping Romanians, Slovaks, Serbs, they will be neutral, or they will be very unlikely to accept Bolshevism. So the antidote, the medicine against Bolshevism is nationalism supporting the neighbors of Hungary, the national former minorities who will not succumb to some people, attractive doctrines of Bolshevism. And so that is again the ill luck of Hungary, that for understandable reasons, Hungarians, some leaders turned towards Soviet Union, Soviet Russia, and that did not influence the very borders. So it is not true what had been thought earlier, and today too some people think that Trianon was a kind of punishment for Bolshevism. This is not true. Perhaps that this Burgenland passed to Austria, it was to some degree influenced by that. Let's make sure that if Hungary remains Bolshevik, at least not the whole old kingdom should remain Bolshevik. And anyhow, West Hungary was mainly inhabited by German speakers. Many of them had a Hungarian consciousness, but anyhow, the ethnic principle was more observed on the western border of Hungary than on any other borders. And finally, I may say one more word which I wanted to mention, that I am very proud of this cover. This is an engraving by Walter Crane, one of the pro-Hungarian Britons, And I am very grateful to Katalin Keserű. I don't know whether she is here or not. She planned to come, the art historian who discovered this for the second edition of my work, and Helena History Press and Sebastian, its expert, made this cover, which I'm very proud of, and it shows Art Nouveau Hungary, which was not only a bigger country, but a great patron and a very successful country in the arts.
On your behalf, I'd like to thank the three speakers today. I think we've had an intellectual feast. We understand much more than we did before. I'd like to mention that we are going to be holding another book launch conference on the 8th of October, when Nicholas Parsons' essays, Civilization and Its Malcontents, will be the basis of a conference on culture wars. I'd like to thank Katalin Kajdar-Lin for this splendid book, and I agree entirely with the closing remarks that Géza just made about Walter Crane. Of course, one of the great socialist artists of the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, and a conservative like myself still finds it wonderful stuff, and I love that particular movement in socialism. If only all socialists were those socialists. Thanking our speakers, I'd like to tell all of you that we are going to be having a reception immediately at 2 rooms beyond here. Oh, and I should have mentioned that on the 8th of October, the conference on Nicholas Parsons' book will be at the National Museum. So I hope to see you there. I hope the tremendous discipline you've shown wearing your masks throughout this conference won't be necessary, but if it is, I still hope to see you there with the masks. So thank you very much, and thank you to the three speakers.